Hello! What with the end of Lightwave, what with the end of the year on the horizon, let's save some of these techniques for prosperity and model something a little festive. So take a big gulp of eggnog and try and hold it down, because we're going to start from scratch. We'll begin with a trunk. So what we need for that, we'll need a disc. We're going to go low poly, so let's just make it 8 sides. We'll go tall and narrow, so I'm going to make this 10 meters tall. So that was pretty easy, and what we're going to do is we're going to taper it in at the top, so it's thin at the top and thicker at the bottom. Just using the taper for this, in we go, and that's fine for our trunk. Q to give it a surface, we'll call this trunk. We'll remove the spec. Actually, while we're here, let's give it a color, so F5 to bring up the surface editor, and under trunk, let's go to the color. And just a little reminder here, the open library button has a nice collection of colors under here, so we'll go for the browns and we'll choose something dark chocolatey. Very nice. And also, just to keep things nice and tidy, let's call this layer trunk. Great. We'll create a new layer and we're going to put a branch in here. Now I have a PNG on a transparent background that has our branch leaves on it, and we're going to be using this. We'll drag that into the window. I'm going to draw out a box here and I'm going to make it 1 meter deep. So let's just check that, 1 meter, that sort of width, but I'm going to give it 2 segments. There we go. And then I'm going to F3. I'm going to rest on ground, but in the Z direction. So I'm just going to click on the Z and OK that. And let's put us right at the origin, pointing down the Z axis. Let's call this branch. So let's add that as a texture. I'm going to use the top viewport here as a UV. I'm going to load that Christmas branch texture here. As you can see, Lightwave's not great with PNG and transparencies, but this doesn't actually show up. It's just a bit of screen corruption. God knows what it is. Anyway, it won't hold us up here. So we'll go for T for texture, and we'll hit the plus icon. And we'll call this branch. It's difficult to see, but it has done what we need it to. Now we just need to see what's going on. What we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on how it looks in OpenGL for the moment. We're going to deal with the proper texturing later on. F5 to open the surface editor, branch selected, and we'll go to our graph. Let's go for a standard node. We'll plug the standard straight into the OpenGL. So as I mentioned, this won't actually render like this. This is purely how it looks in OpenGL. We'll open the standard. We should go to the color channel. Layer type is good. Projection, we want that UV, so we'll point that to the UV map, and the image we want to that Christmas branch. And while that's open, let's copy this, copy current layer, and go over to the transparency channel and replace current layer. So that's done. I can close that down. So this is what we have, and we can't see any transparency. It would be nice, so we're going to press D on the keyboard for display options and go over into the GL tab. So I found the way in Modeler to get this work is under the shading method to use this PB blah blah blah, and you'll see it's kind of done what we want but in the wrong manner. So let's bring up F5, go to the branch again, bring up the standard, and under the transparency we're just going to invert that there. So here we go, we now have a PNG with transparency. In fact, while we're here, let's make it double-sided. There we go. So now we have this and a UV map and a texture. Let's press H, and in the UV texture, I might go to selection, finger on the control key. Let's squash that down. It's hard to see on a white background. We go to the image editor and let's take the brightness down. We'll have to remember to knock it back up later, but at least we can see what we're doing. And we have our first branch. Now we're not going to keep it like that. I'm going to select that branch, copy, paste. I'm going to give it a bit of volume just by rotating it. Let's turn it up to selection. Let's rotate it, 45 degrees. And since we have 2 branches, let's make use of the other one. So that's mapped pretty nicely. Let's go to the top view. Perhaps we can squash it in a bit. Copy, paste, let's rotate it another 45. There we go, something like that, just a little bit irregular. Cool, so now we have a low poly branch. That transparency is not working brilliantly, but life's too short. Let's move on. Press F7 and we'll name this branch. Okay. While we're here on the branch, I'm just going to create a morph. Let's call it bend. And we'll try and hunt down the bend tool. There it is. Finger on the control key. Let's just take this up. There we go. We don't necessarily need to use full 100% of that. And finally, let's go to the last layer here. And what we're going to do is create a bauble. So we're just going to go for a simple ball. Let's make it tessellated. And let's name that bauble. Let's go to the color. Let's choose a red that looks a little bit, let's go for, I don't know, what's that, maroon? Let's try maroon. I'm going to smooth that and okay there. Whoa, that's bright. It'll burn your retinas. Right mouse click on the color to change it from RGB to hue, saturation and brightness or value. So in summary, we have a trunk, we have a branch and we have a bauble. Go to town on yours. Save that out and I'll see you in layout. Here we go, fresh scene, a little bit of housekeeping first. I'm going to turn off all the lights, both the lights and the camera. Let's create a new null, let's call it instanced. Select the branch, the bauble and the instanced null, press E. And they should have parented to the last selected null there, but it clearly hasn't, so there's a bug. Just out of interest, let's try it in sequence view. So select that, that and that object last, press E, and in that case it works. So do with that what you will. Great, so what we're going to do is we're going to turn these off and we're going to turn them off from the renderer and we're going to lock them as well because we're not going to see those. And finally, Control P to bring up the properties. I'm going to turn off the global illumination, and for the environment light, I'm going to turn off the visible to camera. Okay, now select the trunk and we will continue. I'm going to instance branches to this, P for properties, pop over to the instancer tab and add an instance generator. We'll call this branches. Add the branch, so add object, branch. We'll turn this on so we can see it. Now quite simply, for type, we're going to choose the radial array. Let's first whack up the amount. So something like this, you notice they're all pointing in the wrong direction. Over in the rotation tab, align, go to rim. That's all good. Now we know our trunk is 10 meters tall, so I'm going to put an offset of 10 meters in here. Now the radius I'm going to take down so it's closer to the origin, something like 5 centimeters, I think is good enough for this. And for the end angle, we're just going to keep on going until we get loads of rotations. Let's take out some of this uniformity. We'll go over to the offset tab. We'll take up the Y here just to take the pattern out of it. Perhaps we could go down as well. Don't worry that it's extending over the top of the trunk here. We're going to sort that out in a moment. You notice the transparency isn't working too well either. Spend a bit of time faffing about with this. It's all a bit darker, and then I've got to go to streaming and then I've got to turn on the transparency. There we go. I'm feeling a bit of a lag by doing that, so I'm just going to stick it on a default and persevere. Let's deal with the shape of this tree, and we're going to do that using the scale. Over to the scale tab, we're going to go nodal here, so we're going to change the mode to uniform. So over to the nodes. I found a nice trick. If you resize the window to where you want it to be and hit the tidy nodes, everything will bunch up. We need to know the base position of each of these instances. I'm going to use the base position for that, but we need the Y position. So we're going to get a vector scalar and a gradient. So our vector scalar will be, as mentioned, the Y channel. So we'll take the base position, get the Y and feed that into a gradient. And now our color output, in this case, will feed the scale. So we don't see anything because we got 0 here. So we know our height is 10 meters. We're going to put in 10 here and add a keyframe. We can't actually see anything, so we'll keep that black. Obviously we want to see our branches at the base here, so I'm going to put in 100%. It's a good start, but we want a bit bigger than that. And we do that with the alpha channel. So we'll just pull up the alpha channel until we get something big and bushy. But actually at the very top there, I don't necessarily want it to be at 0%. So I'm going to make it a little bit larger just at the top. Okay, so that's pretty good, but that brings us into our first issue of seeing bits beyond the trunk. Let's bring a new gradient, and we'll take our Y position, we'll feed that into there. But this time we'll use the color into the weight. So again, everything disappears. But if we turn this up to 100%, everything reappears, but we want it cutting off at this point here. So let's go to 10 meters. And we'll add a black keyframe in here, i.e. nothing, but it graduates out, which we don't want. So we're going to change this key here to step. And now we have control over the cutoff point of those branches. So this is a good start. This is all nice and procedural, so we can come back and change this at any point. While we're here, let's just close this down and we'll select our base branch instance and press P for properties. Let's remove these just to save confusion, and we want the morph that we created earlier. So I'm going to reach for the morph mixer. I'm just going to add a little bend to those branches. There's numerous ways you could do this, but a morph is just quick and dirty for now. Back to the instance generator. Let's try a bit of randomness in the rotations. Just minor stuff really. If you're happy with this, you could always bake out these instances and go into Modeler for further refinement. But if you wanted to keep it live and editable, there's a couple of hurdles to jump over first. First problem is the rotation. Now, for whatever reason, you may want to rest it on its side. But as you can see, it goes a bit wonky, but there is a quick fix. Basically, what we're going to do, rather than use the Y channel, we're going to use the length. And by doing that, it's basically referencing the base position from the item's pivot point. So if we now move it around, we're locked in. Second issue, position. What's that all about? We're going to need help from another node, and this node is got to be dpkit's item info. The reason we're going for the item info from dpkit is because it defaults to item self. Now I don't believe there's anything natively that has this self option. If you're just going to be making one tree, then use Lightwave's bog standard item info and point it to the trunk. But since we want to duplicate up, we're going to use DP's version. Basically what we're going to try and do is change the base position of the instances relative to that of the position of the trunk. It's probably easier if we just do it. We'll leave the item info on self, so we don't need to touch that, but we do need a subtract node. We'll get the vector flavor. So we need the base position, and we need to subtract in case this trunk gets parented to something. We'll take the world position. We'll subtract that from the base position, and we'll just replace this vector here. So I've just accidentally found out that pressing T is the tidy nodes shortcut on this window, but if I go to this window and press T, obviously it's translation. So if we now move the tree about, it is again rock solid. This is good, but this now leads in to our third and final issue, and that's scale. So if I now scale it up, all sorts of weirdness begins to happen. So we're nearly there, but not quite. It's a little bit annoying we have to do this, but here we go. So we've got the gradient and we know the output here is 10 meters, and that is what we basically want to scale. So let's click on show key inputs. Now we know what the scale is because we're scaling the trunk, so we have access to that here. So I'm going to get a scalar and a multiply. Okay, so I'm going to take the scale of the trunk. And it's going from a vector into the scalar, so it will just take the x from the scale. It's just something to bear in mind. Now we know the gradient is 10 here. So let's enter 10 into the scalar, into the multiply, and then into the position of that gradient. So now when we scale up, that's scaling up nicely, but obviously we've got to do a similar process with the weight. Actually make one little tweak while we're here. Something like that. We can tweak this all later. We want to show key inputs for this one, and then we want to do the same for the out. You might have to click on the gradient for the UI to update. So we just got to go through here, copy, paste. So this position 0.6, let's use that. Don't copy and paste using the keyboard shortcuts. On a Mac, you will get a crash. Just check the settings in case there's some weird overlap and that didn't go in properly. Here we go. You just now have to remember that you use these sliders rather than the sliders in the gradient to control any cutoffs. Let's quickly test the rig so the rotations are looking good. Quick duplicate, test the translation and scale. Also looking pretty solid. Delete those, reset this one, and move on to the baubles. Now we've done most of the hard work with the branches here, so I'm going to add another instancer. I'm going to right mouse click on this and copy. Select this one and paste into and rename baubles. We're going to keep all of these settings, but we're going to swap out the branch for the bauble. We don't want these to scale, we just want them to offset. So I'm going to change the mode to random. I will add a little bit of randomness, they are a bit on the large side. We'll pop over to the offset tab and we'll change the mode to uniform because we're going to do this nodally. And while we're here, rotations, let's zero all this out because it's not going to make a lot of sense. We're dealing with offset next and we're not using scale, and we're kind of set up here. I'm going to go for a make vector. But first let's just plug this into the offset, see what's happening. It's kind of interesting, but obviously far too offset. Let's open the gradient. Now at the base where we've got 300% alpha here, let's take that down. The top key of the gradient will bring the radius down a little as well. We want to break up some of this uniformity here, and this is why we got the make vector. So we'll take the color into the X and the Z or Z, and then into the offset. If we look in the Y, nothing is happening there. However, if we go for a random scalar, what we can do is we can take the index of each instance into the seed and the output into that Y position, and we can play with some values in here. So we may want to go higher, we may want to go lower, we don't want to go that high certainly, but let's just keep it between 0 and 1. For now, that's quite nice. Finally, we'll use the other gradient on the weight to do the cutting of the top and the bottom. We'll adjust some values first. Now we've got it as a step here, which is, it's not doing anything because we've got to move the slider. So you can see that's working quite nicely at the top, but there's a few too many at the top. Perhaps we can change the base as well, so we'll bring that up. Okay, so like I say, there's a few too many at the top. Now we'll change it from stepped and we'll use linear. Perhaps we will raise it up slightly. Let's say we're happy with that. Perhaps the arrangement isn't to your liking, so you could always try the random seed to get a different pattern. So we'll stick with that and we'll move on to some texturing, and we're almost there. Let's texture this thing up. A couple of tweaks first. I'm going to turn off the baubles because we're going to concentrate on the branches first, And then I'm also a bit tight on space here, so I'm going to go over to the view and use an additional viewport, and we'll turn VPR on for that. Cool, so this is what we have. I'm going to leave the OpenGL stuff. You can see that as a poor man's look dev almost. So let's close that down and move that to the side. I'm going to use this principled shader. Let's get an image node and point to that branch texture. Color into the color. It's looking a bit dark. Let's sort out the clipping first. You may think just plugging the alpha into the clip would work, but actually give us the inverse. So we'll take the alpha into the invert and then the invert into the clip, and everything is a little brighter. That's looking pretty nice actually, but we could do with tweaking some of the rotations and possibly adding some more instances, all of which we can do later, but it definitely needs some color variation. We'll get an instance info node, and we'll also get a gradient. Now we want to take the fixed random into the input here. Regardless of how many instances you have, there will be a number between 0 and 1. So we'll make use of that here. We'll keep the key at the top, but we'll add a key at the bottom, and we'll show outputs for both of those. So we'll take the color for the first key into there. So what will happen now is it will transition between the image here to black. I forget what it's called. Color tool. Here we go. So we'll take a color tool. We'll take the color from the image node, and we'll also connect that into that second key. Nothing has changed, but if we go into here and change the hue, let's just push it up just to show it how it does actually work. There we go. So 180 degrees is very colorful. I'm happy with that. Let's keep that as is, and we'll show a slightly different technique on the baubles. So let's press P for properties and turn those baubles back on. They're looking like oranges at the moment. I think we'll make them 100% metallic. So as before, we'll get an instance info node. But just to show a slightly different technique, let's get a random add node. We'll take the ID index into the add, and then the result into the seed. Just give it a number, any old number. Now it's important for the range to be from 0 to 1, and we'll include the minimum and maximum values. We'll add a gradient, random scalar into the input of the gradient, and then the color into the color. So that'll give us black. Let's give it a better color. A glowing magenta. Just to begin with, we'll put a key about halfway point. I'm just going to keep it red for now, not much of a colour variation. But if we change the smoothing to stepped, it'll either be one colour or the other. And if we don't like that arrangement, I've added this node here. So changing this value would be like changing the random seed. Essentially, that is it. All that remains now is the tweaking, which you can easily do by jumping into the instance generator. The links to the scene files can be found in the description below. I hope it's been of use.